right, let me take this across to the big story right here on the India development debate. I'm Supriya Shrinate, and it really is a bolt from the blue as far as RBI Governor Urjit Patel is concerned. He's quit with immediate effect, coming on the back of a rift with the government over a host of issues, starting from PCA framework to having a separate payments regulator. Dr. Patel cited personal reasons as the only cause for his discontinuation. From excess liquidity as far as NBFCs are concerned, to dilution of PCA norms, to reserve sharing. The fault lines were very, very deep. And one saw this coming almost. This is the first time since economic liberalization when a governor has stepped down before completing his tenure. Both Prime Minister and of course his Finance Minister, Arun Jaitley, meanwhile, have lavished superlatives on the departing governor. Yet the abrupt decision to quit has already kicked up a huge political storm. Congress President Rahul Gandhi has questioned the credibility of the RBI and the attack on institutions. Patel's immediate predecessor, Raghuram Rajan, has raised an alarm stating it is a matter of concern and his biggest weapon of protest. And I'm going to go across to a stellar panel that's joining me right here. Arvind Mayaram, India's former finance secretary, and also he was on the board of RBI by the virtue of being the Secretary Department of Economic Affairs. I've also got Dr. Rakesh Mohan, former Deputy Governor of RBI. I've got Professor T.T. Ram Mohan from the IIM Ahmedabad, and of course, our consulting editor, Maithili Bhusnurma. Thank you very much, each one of you, for being with us. Dr. Rakesh Mohan, if I may begin with you, were you surprised, were you shocked, were you saddened by Dr. Patel quitting? Because his quitting is, he may have cited personal reasons, but I think everybody who tracks macroeconomy and not even otherwise would know that relationship was extremely acrimonious, and his resignation is almost timed at the peak of that acrimonious relationship.
I think that my main reaction really is of great sadness and this turn of events, along with a certain degree of shock. Even though, of course, from all the reports, one has known about the increasing tensions between the government and the Reserve Bank. And it was because of the number of issues that have arisen in the last few months that I had indeed been moved to write my three-piece articles in the Business Standard about 2 months ago on many of the issues that had been arising. And I had, as I mentioned in those articles, that in fact the Reserve Bank has been subject to increasing pressure right over the last 10 years. And that has been, there's obviously had its impact on the Reserve Bank, but it's indeed still a day of great sadness that an institution that has been a pillar of strength and stability for the country over its existence since 1935 has had to suffer this kind of consequence of the tensions that have arisen between the government and the Reserve Bank. I also want to add that I've always had the view, and I've said so, that the central bank of any country is ultimately one arm of the government, like all other regulatory agencies. And there has been a growing consensus around the world that country is best served by the central bank having a large degree of autonomy or independence in the interest of financial stability in the country. And therefore, it's really a joint enterprise. And to my mind, it's a pity that government and Reserve Bank have been looked at as adversaries, when that shouldn't be the case at all.
Fair point. Right. I'm going to take this across to, I think that's a very important point that you say that, you know, some of it was festering for years now. I'll take this across to Dr. Arvind Mayaram. And so you've been on the RBI board, and as finance secretary, you know, you were also the finance secretary when your former boss, Mr. Chidambaram, said if the government has to walk the path of growth alone, so be it. But many people thought that creative tension between the RBI and the government is warranted. But do you believe in this present scenario, things came to a point where the creative tension gave way to a lot of acrimony? And what would you attribute this to? Was this personality, clash? Did it go beyond the realm of creative tension? I mean, why could some of these issues not be sat across the table and salvaged?
I cannot say for certain what brought the situation to a head. But whatever we are reading, it's very clear that there were large number of issues where the government was wanting certain direction to be taken, and the RBI was unwilling to do so. In my opinion, such a situation should never have arisen, because in the past also we have seen there has been tension between the Reserve Bank of India and the Finance Ministry or the government, but this was almost always resolved through a lot of conversations and also through persuasion. It's very clear that government of the day always has certain concerns, and those concerns are brought about because of a lot of ground pressures which are built upon the government, rightly so in a democratically elected government. But we have, in the past, we have always found that the Reserve Bank of India would be able to provide certain solutions which may not be exactly the way government wants, but the outcome would be almost what is desirable or required for that particular moment. Now, this time it appears that there was a complete breakdown on that. The consensus building broke down. And I think that's a failure on both sides, but I would say it's a much greater failure on the part of the government than on the part of the Reserve Bank of India, because the government, of course, as the prime partner in this relationship, has to play a much more moderating role rather than a role of a confrontationist.
Okay, those are strong statements coming in from both our speakers, Dr. Arvind Mairam and Dr. Rakesh Mohan. But Professor T.T. Ramohan, if I may come to you, and many people say, and I don't know if you agree, that the big trigger for this exit eventually turned out to be the efforts to make RBI a more board-governed, a more board-controlled institution. World over, that's not the practice. Does this ouster, does this resignation mean there will be breaks on that exercise, or is this actually going to make things easier? And do you believe, in fact, that that was the immediate trigger?
Well, it's very hard to say what the immediate trigger was. We know that differences have been building up over a wide range of issues. But as to your specific question on whether the board, the RBI should be board managed, I think there is some semantic confusion on this issue. RBI being board managed does not mean board driven. To my mind, board managed means all policy issues come to the board for discussion. So it's entirely open to the RBI management to convert the other representatives, the other members of the board, to their point of view. It is also open to the other members of the board, including the government representatives, to convert the RBI management to their point of view. So the RBI board is a forum for active discussion. And I think it would be incorrect on the part of RBI not to bring important issues to the board for discussion, which seems to have happened, judging by what I've read in the media in some cases, and at least in relation to the February 12 circular issued by the RBI. So I think all matters must be discussed by the board must have its say, and then the RBI management is free to decide what exactly should be done. But let me also say, reacting to some of the comments I heard earlier, that on some of these issues, it's perfectly possible for reasonable people to have honest disagreements. So, I mean, just to take the specific issue of, say, transfer of reserves from the RBI, we have had very distinguished former officials of RBI saying
Professor T.T. Ramohan, give me a minute.
Like
Professor T.T. Ramohan, give me a minute. I will come to specific issues, sir. Professor T.T. Ramohan, if you may give me a minute, I will come to specific issues.
No, it's a general point that I want to make, that this is not a contest between good and evil. Yeah, so I'm saying that disagreements do not mean that one side is good and the other side is evil. People can legitimately differ.
Fair point. Okay, let me just go across to Dr. Rakesh Mohan. And Dr. Rakesh Mohan, the semantics don't matter here, whether it's board governed or board managed or board controlled. The reality is that many people believe, including Raghuram Rajan, who was with us a short while back, that overt politicization of the board should be avoided at all costs. Do you believe that Lakshman Rekha has been breached?
Before I give a specific comment on your question, I think one needs to understand the somewhat unusual structure of Reserve Bank of India governance that most other central banks, like the US Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and many others, the board actually consists of the equivalent of the governor and deputy governors only, with no representation from the government in most cases, although not all, and no external members in a sense. So, for example, the U.S. Federal Reserve has a chairman who is the equivalent of the governor, and governors who are the equivalent of the deputy governors. And that's the board. Similar is the structure of ECB. Our structure obviously derives from the Bank of England, and which has what they call the Court of, I think it's called the Court of Directors. And as we know, in that structure, all the policy and operational decisions are indeed now made by a certain committee structure, the Monetary Policy Committee, which we also have now. We also have now, I think what's called a Financial Stability Committee, and the third committee, one is in charge of macroprudential issues, the other microprudential issues. So the point I'm making is that this issue of board governance of the Reserve Bank, the way it is actually operated, is not that different from other central banks in the sense that almost all policy and operational decisions are indeed made by the governor and the deputy governors, with overall oversight by the Reserve Bank of India board. I would also say that, to my knowledge, in the past, there has never been an attempt to politicize the board. And therefore, I certainly go along with Ram Rajan in saying that politicization of any central bank board should be avoided. Second, also in terms of what Mayuram was saying, and I think he was quite correct, that the Reserve Bank and the government really have to work together. The Reserve Bank is very much, or any central bank, is very much a part of overall governance of the country. The reason why central banks, the convention over the last maybe 2 or 3 decades, has grown to be independent, quote, independent of the government, is really much more it's the governments that have made them so. It's in the interest of government to insulate monetary policy making, financial sector regulation, financial stability issues from day-to-day political pressures. As Arvind Bayram said, the government is indeed subject to all kinds of pressures from the ground up, and it is in its own interest that you set up different regulatory authorities to be independent of these interests. And obviously, there has to be a meeting of mind. As he said, our tradition has always been a great degree of discussion. And so it should have never been the case that you come to a pass when the tension rises so much, you cannot resolve, and which you're not able to resolve through discussions, that the governor is moved to resign. I would imagine that it must have been an extremely difficult decision for Governor Patel to have taken this decision to resign, because it is obviously not something you just do in haste or on peak. He must have had, I presume, good reasons to do so.
Oh yes, oh yes. And if he had to do it in haste, many people thought he could have done it on the 19th of November and would not wait up until today to quit, which is the 10th of December. But before I go back to Dr. Mayuram again, I will go across to Maithili, because Maithili, I think you belong to a minority out there that believes this is in the larger interest of the RBI. I don't know if I've got it completely right, but you do believe if matters reach a flashpoint like they did, the backing off has to be done by both parts. And in this case, you believe resignation is perhaps the right thing to do. Have I got that right? And why do you believe so?
Well, I didn't say it's in the larger interest, Supriya. This is a very unfortunate turn of events. But my position is that if the government and the monetary authority are going to be constantly at loggerheads, that is far worse in a situation where the governor finds that his differences with the government are irreconcilable and hence decides to resign. Because the situation that we've been seeing over the past 2-3 months doesn't serve anybody any good, particularly the country. So if you have a situation where you really is, the governor feels that he just cannot get on with the government, then it's far better that he quits. So that is what I think is fine, rather than saying that it is a good situation. It's not a good situation at all. It's a very unfortunate turn of events. But given the two choices between constant friction, constantly being at loggerheads, and all of this being played out in the media, it is better the governor says that, look, I cannot continue like this, and so I put in my papers. And let me tell you, Supriya, this is not the first governor. If you include Raghu Rajan, this is the sixth governor of the Reserve Bank of India who has quit. And the first governor to quit after independence, Benegal Ramarao, quit under Pandit Nehru. And Pandit Nehru sent him a very nasty, harsh letter saying very clearly that the government is supreme, and if you cannot, the monetary authority cannot get on with the government, it is almost better that you quit. So this is not a first, it is a sixth, but certainly not a happy sixth.
No, Maithili, as far as Raghuram Rajan was concerned, he finished his term. Urjit Patel has quit before he finished his term, and which is why it's important. And I think it's also important because he's quit at a time when the war is so out in the open. But your point well taken, and I think we stand to gain from your perspective there. But Dr. Arvind Mairam, I'll come back to you. And I think on specific issues, there are issues of disagreement, and if I may take them step by step. Whether it is reserve sharing, whether it is additional liquidity in the economy, especially for the NBFC segment, or whether it is dilution of PCA norms, these are obvious areas of friction. These are obvious points of dissent, and the resignation is an ultimate statement of dissent by the governor. But what happens to these specific issues? Because some of these issues, I think in the last board meeting, the best way to deal with them was, let's make a committee, and that's what happened with PCA, that's what happened with reserves. What happens to these specific areas of concern and areas of the big bones of contention?
Well, each one of them has to be resolved. And if you look at, for instance, the question of reserves, even earlier there were these concerns which were raised by the government, because the RBI board Act clearly states that all the surplus that the RBI generates belongs to the government. However, having said that, while there was always this jockeying for more resources within the government. Even when I was finance secretary, we would all the time try and push a little more to get a little more from the RBI. But the fact was that at the end, it was only through persuasion, whatever we were able to push for, and whatever RBI agreed to, that went along. And so it's always been a case, but it has never been in a manner where the government would issue a Section 7 notice for discussion on issues of this nature, because then it becomes a very formal threat to the RBI to say, you do this or else we shall invoke that power. So I think the problem lies here more in the manner in which these are dealt with, not that these issues have arisen, because these issues have arisen. In future there will be more such issues, and they will have to be sorted out. They will have to be sorted out through building of consensus on both sides. There is always a give and take in these kind of situations. However, it has all to be done under wraps, and it should not be done out in the public view, because RBI is exceptionally and critically important for financial stability, and also for the global image of India as a very stable economy. And therefore, any kind of upheaval that happens like it has happened this time does damage India's reputation abroad.
No, there is absolutely no denying that. And I think you're absolutely right. And I said it in my comments early on in the day as well, that unlike another agency like a CBI, which has been called a caged parrot, or his master's voice and things like that, or an ED where reputations are, all the time questionable, the intents are questionable. As far as the RBI is concerned, it is an institution of impeccable repute and credibility, and anything that mars that should have and must be avoided. But just to be the devil's advocate for a minute, and Professor T.T. Rammohan, let me come to you on this. There is a certain give and take in every relationship, and why should RBI and the government's relationship be any different? Do you believe there were signs of a breakdown in relationship, and the RBI almost invited it upon themselves what really followed? I'm not a big fan of Section 7. I think it should have never been invoked. But the fact that the RBI did not send representatives for Feb 12th circular, the fact that in the last monetary policy, Governor Patel did not come for his customary meeting with Finance Ministry, things were leading to a point where they were really taking on each other. And that amounts to a lot of breakdown of communication as well. I'm just being the devil's advocate, and I'm really speaking the Finance Ministry's language before I go to specific issues.
Yes, I mean, there were very serious differences, perhaps differences that are fundamentally irreconcilable. I'm not in a position to comment on the quality of communications, because whatever I know about the subject is what I've read from the media. But I think we did have a situation where the only honorable course for the governor, given his perception that the differences, at least some of the differences, were not reconcilable, the only honorable course was for him to step down. And I think in any institution, I mean, a governor, RBI governor quitting before his term is over is a matter of sadness. But I think in any institution which is subject to, any technocratic institution which is subject to broad civilian oversight, where the technocrat has a fundamental difference with the civilian authority, I think it is an order that the technocrat steps down. So it is a correct thing to do professionally. And I would not go so far as to call it a disaster. I mean, it is sort of inevitable. And I think the principle of civilian oversight over technocrats is something that should not be taken lightly. And let me just mention here that even a secret agency like MI6 in the UK, has unilaterally, at the instance of its former head, it has unilaterally subjected itself to a certain modicum of civilian oversight, because the technocrats came to believe that it was in the larger interest of the institution to have a certain kind of civilian oversight. So I think the idea of independence should not be construed to mean freedom, complete freedom from civilian oversight. You see, ultimately it is the elected representatives who must prevail in any situation vis-a-vis the technocrats, leaving aside the subject of monetary policy, for which by statute a separate dispensation has been created.
Fair point, fair point. I respect the authority of an elected government, but there's a reason why you have specialists, and there's a reason why you have institutions, and their credibility and autonomy should be preserved. But having said that, yes, the elected government of the day must have a say in matters as important as monetary, at least, economic management. But Dr. Rakesh Mohan, there is something that caught me by surprise. The messages that came out from the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister, and interestingly, by Mr. S. Gurumurthy as well, who was seemingly quite a rabble-rouser in the board meeting, are very, very amiable. I mean, they're thanking Governor Patel for his services, telling what a hard rock of an economist he's been, and how they wish him well in public life and all of that. My question really is, quite ironically speaking, is the government heaving a sigh of relief? Because here is a man who was resisting some of what they wanted to do, and he is gone. Is the government really heaving a sigh of relief?
No, I have no idea whether the government has any feeling in general. So I have no comment at all on what has gone on. Obviously, I have no knowledge of what has gone on in discussions between the government and Governor Patel. But I did want to make one comment before I go, which is some disagreement with T.T. Ramohan, where he made a comparison with the MI6. Now, the spy agencies, the army, etc., are not even supposed to be independent or autonomous from the government. They are integral parts of any government, like any department of the government, like any secretary in the government is not independent of the minister. Whereas regulatory authorities, and particularly the central bank, among regulatory authorities, and of course the Monetary Policy Authority, are designed to be autonomous. However, I have always maintained that there needs to be a great degree of discussion between the government and the Reserve Bank, and it has been a bit unfortunate that the government has been seeing that the Reserve Bank has been seen as an adversary of the government. In fact, it is also, in the overall scheme of things, integral part of any government, any central bank, but at a certain degree of autonomy and independence for very good reasons, which I had outlined earlier. So this is indeed, to my mind, a very sad development. It's a commentary on a breakdown of relationship within the government, in a sense, which should have been avoided at all costs. I also don't agree with Maithili. There's a sixth governor resign. Yes, many governors' terms have not been renewed, but it's a very, very unusual occasion for the governor to resign midway through his tenure, only after just 2 years of tenure. Most other central banks have much longer tenures, and this kind of resignation in the last, say, 2 or 3 decades has been a very, very, very rare occasion. To my recollection, this has only happened in Argentina, and that's not a country that we should aspire to be compared with. So I certainly find this development to be very sad for the country, for the Reserve Bank. I do hope that good sense will prevail all around to provide stability and strong leadership in the Reserve Bank, which is also then respected by the government. Thank you very much for having me on. I do need to go now, Supriya.
Fair point. I know you extended your time with us, but we'll continue the discussion with Dr. Arvind Mayaram, Professor T.J. Rammohan, and Maithili Busrura. Maithili, I want to come to you, and the reason why I'm asking you this question is because we've had many discussions on, whether it's rational to transfer reserve, whether it's rational to make the RBI look the other way and say dilute PCA norms. We can't find a way out of, we've got to shrink balance sheets when we have big banks and not make them lend again. On NBFC, we've had this chat that the government of the day, and perhaps rightly so given their mandate, would want growth, would want economic opportunity, would want job creation, but the RBI knows too well how much liquidity can be managed and what begins to stoke inflation. Are these issues that whoever comes next will have to, agree with as far as the RBI stance is concerned? Because I'm presuming that the RBI as an institution was opposed to it, and I don't think Urjit Patel himself was opposed to it, and everybody else in the RBI kind of backed it. So how does this go from here on? Because most people develop a backbone, they say, when they move to Mint Street.
Well, it's not, I agree, it would be the institution's position, but Supriya, let's not forget that community.
Okay, I think there's an audio trouble with Maithili, and if I can please go and fix that audio, because I'd like to take this across to her. I'll go across to Dr. Arvind Mayaram. And Dr. Mayaram, we've had discussions and debates on demonetization. It is a little strange to imagine that a governor who was pliable or who gave in to a draconian quote-unquote exercise that Arvind Subramanian calls it, demonetization, today suddenly wants to, take the government on all these issues. There is a breakdown in communication, doesn't agree on most things, stops meeting the finance minister for monetary policy. What explains him being so pliable then and him being so straitjacketed right now?
Let me not use the terms pliable or obdurate, etc., for the reason that intellectually it is quite possible that Dr. Urjit Patel believed in demonetization, and one can have a difference of opinion with him, but but certainly it doesn't call for labeling him in a particular manner. The question is he standing by his principles, which he believes are important for the institution, that is RBI, and which he believes is important for fiscal stability and for the purposes of monetary policy. Now, here I think the difference of opinion has arisen, and he has, as you have rightly mentioned, it's a RBI as an institution which is of a particular opinion on these issues. I would also like to clarify one thing when it was spoken about MI6 and Army and other institutions. We must remember that it is the parliament which is consists of elected members in a democracy, which enacted a law. RBI has come into being through an act of the parliament, and that act in fact then gives original jurisdiction on certain matters to the RBI. So therefore it is not a creature of the government in the manner where it is being created through an administrative order, but it's through an act of the parliament, and therefore the certain amount of autonomy for the RBI comes because of its statutory nature. So I think the problem will continue unless there is a position of give and take on both sides, and consensus building becomes the norm of the day, rather than demanding certain things to be done in a particular way, or believing that my way is the highway. Those things I don't think can really work in a situation like this. So going forward, I think whoever is brought in as the RBI governor will have to work with the government to create a consensus where a middle path or a common ground is found, and these issues are resolved in a manner which is required and necessary for the economy.
Fair point indeed. But Dr. Mayaram, I do want to still ask very quickly a question to Professor T.T. Rammohan, and I'll come back to you right now. How do you expect markets and stakeholders to react to this? Because the markets for very long thought that Governor Patel was an inflation hawk. He was seemingly obviously resisting liquidity, something again the market participants will vote for. But I'm just curious to understand, how should stakeholders view this? Today, of course, this announcement came after markets were shut for trading. Tomorrow, there is going to be yet another uncertainty that's going to be added to market trading action, elections. I mean, already, the exit polls were weighing the markets down. We now have an aggravated sort of a issue here with Governor Patel resigning. How should stakeholders, and I'm really talking about economic and fiscal stakeholders as well as market participants, be reading into something like this?
Well, it's not possible for me to comment on, what the short-term reaction of the markets would be, how they would react over the next couple of days. But I think over the long term, I think the markets would recognize that both the Indian economy and the RBI have sufficient resilience to withstand an event of this sort. Let's not forget that this is a nation that has weathered the assassinations of 2 prime ministers. And let us also not forget that when Professor Raghuram Rajan stepped down as governor, there were all sorts of dire prophecies about what would happen to the Indian economy. Some people wrote that the foreign portfolio investors would flee in a big way. Some people seem to suggest that the end of the world was in sight. But none of these dire prophecies came true. And also the suggestion that Professor Rajan's successor would somehow be pliable and open to manipulation by government, all that was turned out to be ill-founded. And therefore, I think, knowing the underlying strengths of the Indian economy and the strengths of an institution such as RBI, I would say that in the long term, we don't have to, over a reasonably long period, we don't have to be very apprehensive about the market reaction.
Okay, not apprehensive about the market reaction, but you're obviously cueing me to my next question. And Maithili, if I may quickly pose that question to you. The question is of the successor. And the sense that I get from New Delhi is that the experiment with the economist hasn't quite taken off and they might go back to appointing a bureaucrat. Do you believe that's a safe bet? Is that going to salvage the situation? Is that going to repair the relationship that's very torn? Because I just want to point out for the viewers here, the relationship is not torn between the finance minister and the RBI governor. It's the institution versus the government arm where the relationship is torn, which is why you see tension at various levels between the central bank and the central government.
Supriya, if I could just add to what Dr. T.T. Ramohan said, the fact is that institutions are always bigger than individuals, and an institution like the Reserve Bank of India, which has built up so much credibility, is not likely going to take a beating just because one governor resigns. And to our point about whether the experiment with economists has failed, let me point to the experiment with, quote unquote, with Dr. Rangarajan. Dr. Rangarajan came from academia. He served as a deputy governor, subsequently went to the Planning Commission, then also went on to become governor of the Reserve Bank of India. And he did two very dramatic things. A, he shifted from the fixed exchange rate model to the LERMS model and to a market-driven exchange rate model. He also did away with ad hoc treasury bills, which basically monetized government's deficit. So two major reform measures, and in fact he was the first governor perhaps to talk of independence of the Reserve Bank of India. So it is not necessarily true that an economist always makes or not always is likely to make a bad governor. So it varies, it depends on situations, it depends on personalities, both on the government side as well as the Reserve Bank. And if I quickly answer the question that you asked me earlier, whether the next governor will find the same problems or this is the position of the Reserve Bank of India as an institution. Yes, I would agree that this is the position largely of the institution, but let me also add that the RBI under Governor Urjit Patel had become extraordinarily non-communicative. Now, communication is a very important tool of the central bank, and when this happens, if you just look at the number of speeches made by the governor and the deputy governor under Urjit Patel and under Raghuram Rajan, his predecessor, etc., you will find that the RBI had become extraordinarily uncommunicative, and that is never very good for a central bank. So I think all told, I do hope the next man to the job, all the best. He has a tough job ahead, but it's not necessarily true that an economist will make a bad governor.
Okay. Very quickly, Dr. Arvind Mayaram, will let you have a quick last word, but please kindly make this brief. From here on, the situation has to be salvaged. What do you think is going to happen? Will the government back off because something as big has happened? Or will the government believe this is their chance to have a foot in the door and actually push their agenda?
I don't know what is going to happen, but I really hope the latter doesn't happen. My sense is that the government in its sagacity is going to appoint a person with impeccable credibility and who would be able to actually establish once again to the country and to the world that the governor is of eminence and his word would carry weight. And I think the new governor will have to come and also build consensus, I had said earlier, with the government on several issues. In some issues, the RBI would have to give a little way. In some issues, the government will have to backtrack a bit. I think this is a give and take situation, and this should work out in this manner.
Fair point indeed, and that's putting it in a very, very fair and very balanced way. This is a give and take situation. The two authorities, the monetary and the fiscal authority, are extremely important. It's important that they talk to each other, which is how fair and balanced decision making can also happen. Thank you very much. Can't thank this wonderful panel enough. Dr. Arvind Mayaram, Dr. T.T. Ramohan, and of course Maithili Bisnoormal for taking time out and speaking to us on what is indeed a huge, huge evening as far as the big headline is concerned. Dr. Urjit Patel has quit as governor RBI. The quest is on for the next governor. And this has happened at a time of huge tension between the RBI, the central government and the central bank. Never bodes too well for monetary or fiscal management. But it's a done deal. Urjit Patel is gone. And we will perhaps in the next 2 or 3 days be able to see a successor being appointed. Thank you very much for being with us on this edition of the India Development Debate. We at ET now believe credibility of the institution must be maintained and it must be able to preserve its autonomy.